I'm Chris Fitzsimon with North Carolina Policy Watch, and we're thrilled that you're at our latest crucial conversation. We really appreciate you being here. Today's topic, obviously, is the benefit and amazing impact that immigrants play in North Carolina, which is a message we can't say too often these days, given what's happening in our state, in our country, in our world. But I want to just take 1 second to let you know about something else. If you haven't, if you don't know about our report, NC Policy Watch has just put out a report called Altered State: How 5 Years of Conservative Rule Has Transformed North Carolina. It's available every day. There's a new story that comes available online. We do have a limited number of hard copies. We don't have them here today, but they'll be available at the North Carolina Justice Center. Our holiday reception and party is tomorrow evening, starting at 5:30 at the Justice Center. It's 224 West Dawson Street, South Dawson Street, the corner of Dawson and Martin in downtown Raleigh. So we really hope that if you can stop by and meet the Justice Center staff and pick up a copy of the report. I encourage you, even if you can't, please try to read a copy of this report and spread it around. It really does a decent job, I think, of trying to capture a little bit of the damage that's been done to our state in the last 5 years by the folks who took over in 2010. But today the topic is immigration. We have a great panel. I'm looking forward to hearing it. Thank you very much for being here. I'll turn it over to Rob Schofield.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you all for being here. This is our final crucial conversation of 2015. For those of you who attend lots of them, we appreciate your continued support for NC Policy Watch and the work we're trying to do here in North Carolina. Today's topic is immigrants in North Carolina. Where do things stand? Where do we go from here? We all are painfully aware of the tenor of the 2016 presidential campaign that's going on now in the country, and indeed the debate that's going on at the state level, and how much of it has related to immigrants and immigration policy. And so it seems like an especially timely time to hear from two of the state's most important experts on this topic, who happen, fortunately for us, to be co-workers at the North Carolina Justice Center. Today we're going to hear from Dr. Patrick McHugh, who is sort of fast becoming North Carolina's most important progressive economist. Patrick is a policy analyst at the Budget and Tax Center at the Justice Center. He conducts research and analysis on issues related to the economy and economic policy. And earlier this year, he authored that special report that you all have copies of, Smart Choices in an Era of Migration, which examined how the growing immigrant population in North Carolina has contributed to the economic vitality of the state. Immediately prior to joining the Budget and Tax Center, Patrick served as a fiscal analyst at the General Assembly in downtown Raleigh, where his duties included economic impact modeling, tax and appropriation analysis, and monitoring economic development policy. He's been a great addition to our team, and I think you're going to be hearing more and more from Patrick in the years to come. Another wonderful addition to the Justice Center staff in recent years is Raul Pinto. He is sort of fast become North Carolina's most important attorney in the field of immigration policy. He is the staff attorney at the Justice Center's Immigrants and Refugee Rights Project, where he represents low-income individuals negotiating the immigration system. Prior to joining the Justice Center, Raul worked as an attorney with the American Civil Liberties Union. Some of his former colleagues are here today, of North Carolina. And at the ACLU, Raul's work focused on investigating violations of civil rights with an emphasis on immigrants' rights, racial justice, and community interaction with law enforcement. Say they've both been wonderful new additions to the Justice Center staff, who I think will become more and more prominent in North Carolina, and we're delighted to give them this forum today to speak to you. And I'm going to turn it over to them. I think Patrick's going to go first, and they're going to kind of rotate back and forth. We'll also say hello to our online audience. There'll be a lot of folks watching this event online as well. We'll try to have a question and answer session at the end of the presentations, and try to pass around a microphone in that time so people can hear it. Patrick, I don't know whether you want to use the microphone or not.
I don't know. How's the back of the room? Can we hear without a mic?
Patrick's got a pretty good voice.
All right,
Let's
we're good?
try that.
All right. Well, howdy, everybody. Hope you're doing well. Happy December. I was going to kick off today by giving you a montage of the most extreme, outlandish statements made by prominent political figures on immigration. But then I realized that that would probably make this talk obsolete before I was done giving it, and so decided that was probably not the right way to go. I'm just going to sort of set the stage here briefly, and then Raul's going to delve into some of the details. obviously, we are living through a tumultuous political season when it comes to the topic of immigration. This is a time where challenging times can bring out really damaging myths and give them new life, and I think we're seeing that right now. And so we're going to talk about some of the consequences that those myths are having on the ground here in North Carolina. But we're also going to talk about the hopeful side of the equation, which is that while these myths are getting a lot of airing right now, this is nothing new in American political history, unfortunately, but we have a long history of waves of anti-immigrant sentiment coming to the fore, particularly during challenging political or geopolitical times. So we have a history of overcoming and moving past some of these demons. But it is also, I think, fair to say that the concern for the condition of immigrants in North Carolina and the United States, the recognition of the contributions that immigrants make to our culture, to our society, to our economy, is probably more developed now than for some of the previous waves of anti-immigrant sentiment that we've seen in the past. That there's more mainstream pushback against some of these radical fringe beliefs. And that's obviously our job to cultivate that, to breathe life into it. And so we're going to be talking about both the dangers and the threats and the things that we are right to be concerned about, but also the positive data and the positive information that's happening, that there really is a national recognition that this is an issue that we just can't afford to turn our back on. So I'm going to leave it to Raul at this point, and I'll chat a little bit more later.
Thank you. I'm not going to use the mic either because my grandmother was a speech pathologist, and if I didn't project my voice, I would probably get a ruler in the hand or something. I'll try to project as well as I can. So my name is Raul Pinto. I'm an immigration staff attorney with the North Carolina Justice Center. I appreciate your comments, Rob. Much obliged. I guess I'm here to talk to you about what the landscape is, both at the federal and the state level, mainly because we can't talk about state immigrants without talking about what the federal government is doing, or let me rephrase that, what it's not doing to project and affect the immigrant landscape. So we start talking about the policies that have been implemented decades ago with the limitation and quota system that allows immigrants to come into the United States legally. And so actually, I was sharing some news with Patrick earlier today that if you are a U.S. citizen and you want to bring a son or daughter that is over the age of 21 years old, the person is unmarried, that application will take you 21 years. Right now, USCIS is looking at applications that were submitted in December of 1994. So the wait is very, very long. So what happens is created is a sea of people, last estimate about 12 million people, that have either very limited ways of coming to the United States legally and that are in demand for labor, jobs, and most of them, in my experience, I work with immigrants every day. Most of them just want to come into the United States and provide a better future for their families. And actually, that's part of my story as well. So I was undocumented immigrant for a very long time, and part of that system as well. So most families just want to feed their kids. That's basically it. Get a better education. And so what that has created is this sea of people, again, that here have no way of becoming legalized. And so that is one of the myths that I want to debunk, and I always try to debunk, is it is very, very hard to come to the United States. And so that plays into the rhetoric that has been going on. And so we have a broken federal system. If it's taking you 21 years to get a child, a son or daughter of you here, even though you are a U.S. citizen, then we know we have a problem, right? The DMV doesn't take that long, right? So we don't have problems, and how do we fix it? And that's where the government inertia comes in, right? So about 2 years ago, we had a Senate Bill, Senate Bill 744, that tried to provide comprehensive immigration reform for the United States and tried to implement different policies. Obviously, there were some that were very problematic, like the militarization almost of the border, but it included a pathway to citizenship, which for many people is really the American dream, right? It's being able to obtain citizenship in the United States, obtain all of the privileges that come along with it and all the duties that come along with it as well. So I'm going to keep that in mind. Unfortunately, obviously, the House didn't take up that law, and we've heard obviously from Paul Ryan as of late that he is not going to take comprehensive immigration reform. He's not going to take it up in the House. And so we have that stalled there. And so again, we have a bunch of people that there's no way to get them into the process even. So very limited ways to get into the process. And so what that creates is a hodgepodge of different policies in the states created to address this issue. Obviously some more progressive than others, obviously some more restrictive than others, right? And so recently in North Carolina, we saw the implementation of HB 318. And HB 318 has the potential to be extremely detrimental to the undocumented community. What HB 318 did was to outlaw or ban the use of the consular IDs as a form of identification. And so what happens is that if someone is stopped by the police and is driving without a license, then the person would identify themselves by using their matricula consular, right? But that bill would actually ban that from happening. Now there are some exceptions, obviously. The legislature created some exceptions for law enforcement. The law enforcement exception was created for other community IDs, but the matricula was still banned. Okay, and the matricula consular, when I've spoken to the Mexican consulate, is a secure document. It has a couple levels of security that are implemented when they issue that. And so obviously that was problematic. It was very targeted because the only consulate that we have here in Raleigh from a foreign country is Mexico. So it was very targeted to that community. The ban on sanctuary cities, and that goes along with what Patrick was saying about the rhetoric and the language, right? There were different communities and different towns and cities across the state that were implemented policies where they were going to mandate that their law enforcement officers don't ask for immigration status or don't inquire about it when they were investigating crimes. But the issue was moot after this law passed, and now, while it's not a requirement, we are very worried as to how that's going to play out in the field. And so obviously these laws, these policies are playing into the anti-immigrant rhetoric that has been going on in the state. But on the other hand, we also have good examples, and which we'll talk about a little bit later on, which are examples, for examples like Colorado, who implemented driver's licenses for the undocumented community about 2 years ago. And that was a grassroots community push implemented by the state. I guess I should have started with the fact that in North Carolina in 2006, you were able to get if you were undocumented, you were able to get a driver's license with other documentation. But in 2006, that law changed, and now you are not able to get a driver's license. You need a social security number. And if you are undocumented, you are not eligible to get a social security number. So that proved clearly problematic because we saw immigrants that had been here for quite a long time, sometimes in cases, 20 years, that had been in the state, that had been working in the state, and unfortunately now they were not able to provide for their families, to travel, to take their kids to school, so it became a huge impediment to the integration. And that's a word I think you're going to hear a lot today, is how do we integrate folks that are coming into our communities, becoming part of the fabric of the economy, of the society, and how do we integrate them into our communities, into our culture. And so that's really the problem. And so we're seeing both sides of the spectrum, right? We're seeing, the more positives in the states like Colorado. The other issue we'll talk a little bit about is in-state tuition. As you may know, DACA, the Deferred Actions for Childhood Arrivals, was implemented in 2012. And that provided a work permit for students who had been here since 2007 and who were brought at a very young age by immigrant parents. Right? And that was a huge win and victory for the immigrant community because now those children that were brought, again, through no fault of their own, were able to get work permits, were able to obtain driver's licenses, although some of my colleagues will remember, not without a fight, right? We had to fight the Department of Transportation in order to provide licenses for those students. But those students have been guaranteed that they're not going to be deported, and they're working here legally, and so that is very important. And the other thing that has been stalled in inertia, and I think North Carolina plays an important role in, is the DAPA, Deferred Action for Parents of Americans, or for Parental Accountability, as it was initially called, right? DAPA is a program that would allow deferred action for parents of U.S. citizen and legal permanent residents. Obviously, there are other requirements, and we can talk about those later on, not to get too much into the weeds. But for the most part, if you had a child, you would be able to get that deferred action, would be able to get that employment authorization, and you would be able to continue contributing to the fisc in the state, to your community by getting a license and working and doing all the things that someone with the rights to be in the United States has. And so that has been stalled in the courts. The Supreme Court will probably hear it at some point soon. We expect a decision to come out at some point next year, and we'll see if the program ever goes operational, because we've heard from different candidates, and again, sort of the election, how that's going to impact these policies is very important, right? We're going to try to see how a president from the Republican Party will handle this program, how a president from the Democratic Party will handle this program as well. So there is a chance that this program doesn't see the light of day, but there's also a chance that it goes active before the election, and hopefully we can, we get a victory in that regard. But that has been stuck in the courts, and the governor of North Carolina joined that lawsuit to stall the program. And so that's an important, again, the policy decisions that are being made statewide that are being affected by the negative rhetoric and language. So I'll stop there and give Patrick a welcome back here.
Alrighty. I'm going to run through a number of sort of facts and figures that just demonstrate and illustrate how important immigrants are to the economy of North Carolina. And I think this is really sort of the beginning of, we start at the beginning talking a lot about what we are all rightfully concerned about, but the reality is that the economic history, and I think even the cultural and social history, is really on the side of greater welcoming and greater integration. That there are forces pushing us in that direction that will ultimately prove to be stronger than the forces trying to hold back the sea. Oh,
I think we disconnected there for a second.
Stepped on the cord.
There you go.
All right, let me get this out of the way. So the first thing I think is important to just take a step back and remember as we face a conversation like this, is that folks that are trying to slam the doors of America shut are really proposing a solution that lives in another dimension. Like, we live in a modern, interconnected world. Migration is a fact of that world, and it is not going to stop being a fact of that world. We know that there are all kinds of different forces, violence, economic forces, potentially even climate change down the road, that are going to be driving huge waves of migration around the globe. And there's not a thing that any single government can or should do to stop that. This is a consequence of living in the modern age. And North Carolina can't get out of the way of that any more than the United States can, even if we wanted to. So one of the first things I want to look at is just the magnitude of the change that has happened over the last few decades when it comes to the immigrant population in North Carolina. First of all, here's 1990. And we're looking at the share of residents by county that were born outside the United States. So the darkest blue is only 3%. So even the largest category that we could find in 1990, it's only about 3%. And there's a huge swath of the state where it's less than a 1.5%. Wow. This is, not only, I wanted to make these two maps have the exact same, sort of cut points, the same legend, but that even wouldn't have worked. What was our highest category has become our lowest category. So this has been a huge change to the shape and to the demographic breakdown of North Carolina. And this is not something that you can just turn off. This is not, no matter, even if folks that are rabidly anti-immigrant got every wish that they could dream up, you're still not going to be able to just turn a switch and change generations of change like this. All right. Just to put this a little bit in context, in terms of what we're actually looking at on these maps. The immigrant population in North Carolina from 1990 to 2013 more than quintupled. There are some cities around the state. Charlotte, the immigrant population quintupled. Greensboro, Winston-Salem, it went up by 6 times. Raleigh, Durham, it went up by 7 times. But this is not, as you can see in this map, just a urban phenomenon. And part of what we're seeing in North Carolina is really the change in the way that folks enter the United States. We think back into previous eras, waves of migration, and it was largely clustered through a few gateway cities, through New York, through San Francisco, through Seattle, and that those cities were where a lot of the immigrant population ultimately stayed. And that they stayed largely in cities, and they stayed largely in the cities that they originally came through. But what we've seen in North Carolina is not only is North Carolina, along with the South, becoming a new gateway, a place that people actually enter the United States, it's an increasingly rural phenomenon just as much as it is an urban phenomenon. In fact, there's a number of counties in North Carolina that would have actually seen population decline over the last couple of decades, if not for the arrival of new immigrants, and most of those counties are rural North Carolina. I'll talk in a few more minutes a little bit more about that, but the reality is that the locations that immigrants are setting up homes in are not just in the urban parts of the state. It's an increasingly rural phenomenon as well, and arguably even more important to some struggling, otherwise declining rural communities. All right. So that's just the population sort of shape, though. It doesn't really get into the economic contributions of immigrants in North Carolina. So first of all, immigrants make up about 7% of the population. They're directly or indirectly responsible for around 8 or 9% of the gross state product. So immigrants collectively are pulling more than their own weight economically. We talk often, the conversation around immigration focuses on immigrants as employees, as workers. And one of the things that very often gets overlooked in this conversation is how important immigrants are as entrepreneurs in the United States. Now, there's a long history of this, and it's kind of, at this point, baked into our economic cultural self-understanding. But there's a long, if you look at it, actually about 40 to 50% of the Fortune 500 companies in the United States were founded either by an immigrant or the child of an immigrant. And this runs the gambit from old, venerable corporations like McDonald's and General Electric, all the way up through modern tech behemoths like Google and Apple. I don't know how many folks saw this on Twitter, but while there was a wave of radically anti-Syrian refugee sentiment rolling around Twitter, a number of folks made the observation that, Steve Jobs' father was a Syrian immigrant. And so while you're tweeting about how much you hate Syrian immigrants on your iPhone, take a moment for irony. And while I think that's important, and it's great to talk about these large multinational corporations, really in North Carolina, the contribution of immigrants as entrepreneurs, I think, is the most striking when you look at Main Street business owners. So this is a chart that just shows us the percent of all residents, business owners, and small Main Street business owners that are of immigrant background in North Carolina. So again, about 7%, 7.5% of the population, roughly about 10% of all business owners, but a full 20% of the Main Street business owners in North Carolina are immigrants. And these are mostly the everyday mom and pop service sector businesses that make modern life enjoyable. It's, let me see here. It's about a quarter of all the clothing stores in North Carolina, about a third of all the restaurants, about 40% of all the dry cleaners and laundries. I could keep going on down the list. These are the things that North Carolinians every day wake up expecting to rely upon to get through their day. In some ways, while that is striking, I think it's worth looking at how this has changed over the last 25 years. So this is a little bit complicated, but the line is population. So that's the growth that we were looking at in terms of those maps. That's represented there in terms of the growth and the share of the North Carolina population. But what's particularly striking is in the sort of green color is the growth in the share of Main Street businesses. Now, as we saw, we're now living in a world where immigrants own around 1/5 of the Main Street businesses in North Carolina. But to put that growth in context, immigrants account for around 80% of the new Main Street businesses that have been created since 2000. And again, this is not just clustered in urban North Carolina. This is across North Carolina. That main streets, downtowns, struggling communities have been revitalized by immigrant business owners who are often the first to move in and invest in areas that have previously been struggling. I don't know if anybody's been to Duplin, North Carolina in the last little while, but that is eastern North Carolina, rural agricultural town, so much like so many other rural agricultural towns in North Carolina that have really struggled over the last couple of generations. But Duplin County is home to one of the largest immigrant populations in North Carolina. And you drive up and down the main street of Duplin, North Carolina, and I'd say about 3/4 of the businesses on what is now a revitalized downtown main drag are immigrant business owners. So this is something that, as I was driving into the town, being a country boy, I kind of knew what I was expecting. But the downtown that I found had really undergone a substantial revitalization. It did not really look quite as down at the heels as I was expecting it to. And that is a story that has been replicated again and again and again across the state. And then one last, so we've talked about the footprint in the population, we've talked about the contributions that immigrant business owners make. I think it's worth taking a quick look at the actual impact of the presence of immigrants on the economic health of local communities. So what we did here is we took a look county by county. How do counties with larger immigrant populations stack up economically to counties with smaller immigrant populations? And the answer is counties with larger immigrant populations are doing better economically than counties with relatively few immigrants living in them. The unemployment rate so we've got counties with greater than 6% immigrant and counties that are less than 3% immigrant. The unemployment rate's a full 2 points higher. I mean, this is a couple months, this is a little bit out of date in terms of the economic data, but the unemployment rate was a full 2 points higher. The poverty rate was full 4 points higher. And wages were actually lower in the counties that had small immigrant populations. I'm going to just take a slight moment to sidebar on this point. Obviously, this is one of the things that you will so often hear as an argument, that immigrants are here to take our jobs and drive down wages. And the reality is that there's just no good evidence that that's what actually happens. In fact, the majority of native-born American workers see their wages increase when immigration accelerates in a particular local economy. I'm not saying that there's never any moment of competition or there's never, that there's no concern there. But the economic reality is that this whole trope that immigrants are just taking jobs away from Americans and that they're undermining wages just is not borne out in the actual economic fact. And we can see it here, right? If immigrants really were depressing wages and undercutting the abilities of native North Carolinians to find work, we should expect the exact opposite of this to be happening. But in fact, we see lower unemployment, lower levels of poverty, and better pay in the counties that have a higher immigrant population. One quick caveat to this, or not caveat, but addendum to this. This is not just picking up on the difference between urban and rural counties. I actually separated just urban and rural, and the same distinctions emerge. Rural counties with larger immigrant populations are, on average, doing better than their rural counterparts with smaller immigrant populations, and the same is true for the more urban counties. All right. So I'm going to, as a consequence of this, I'm going to sort of start to shift into, obviously, there are a lot of folks that have started to recognize that the negative myths about immigrants really are not accurate. They don't reflect the economic reality of North Carolina and the United States. And so that is starting to translate, even while we are seeing a lot of these very worrying policy developments with 318 and joining the suit against DAPA and a variety of other things that have happened. We've also seen more and more communities start to look at welcoming and integration efforts as an economic development strategy. And so this is happening here in North Carolina. Charlotte is doing this. I think Greensboro, High Point, want to say Raleigh as well are part of the Welcoming Cities initiative. And there's a whole bunch that's not just here in North Carolina. This is happening across the country. One of the places that's been the most aggressively embraced is the old Rust Belt cities that, like rural North Carolina, have been seeing decades of population decline, people moving out. So places like Cleveland, Detroit, St. Louis have actively started to recruit immigrants to come into their cities. And it's not just, so it's first a question of just sort of raw population replacement, and also places where the population is aging. Japan is now starting to look really intently at how it can attract more immigrants to shift the demographics in a more economically sustainable way. But it also, I think one of the most promising and interesting economic development strategies that's starting to emerge around this is immigrants as essentially networks to the global stage. As we start to live in an increasingly globally integrated economy, having folks that have direct knowledge and experience and networks in countries that we're doing business with is an increasingly important economic benefit to a particular local community. And that's something that we're starting to see communities actively recognize and try to build systems to help immigrants help their local economies. So I'm going to turn it back over to Raul with that.
So I think we wanted to just highlight some of the good policies that have been implemented throughout in different localities throughout the state, but also sort of what's going on statewide. And one of the biggest issues that we've seen in the last couple of years is this driver's license issue, because it's very important. It helps with integration of immigrants into the community. As I said, it's a very important issue because it allows, if someone is undocumented, right, you are still going to work, you are still taking your children to school, you are still going to your religious services, but now you are facing increased law enforcement. I talk to folks who have gotten, 3 tickets per month, and if you start doing the math, that is your entire income going into this to pay for these tickets. And there's just no way that you can get a driver's license or a driving permit here in North Carolina. And so obviously that has been a very important issue. And so what we're seeing is this implementation, and we saw it with the introduction last year of HB 328. And 328 was a mixed bag where it had a driving permit for the undocumented community in the same packet, in the same bill as other anti-immigrant provisions, and much like the 318 provision. So for example, it had the lack of recognition of a particular consular as a form of ID. So it was almost like a negotiating tactic implementing anti-immigrant policies in the same packet as implementing something that's very good for the immigrant community. And I heard it described as sort of the honey that gets the more conservative anti-immigrant folks behind this idea of driving permits. And so clearly that language is very troublesome. And 328 actually was created as a result, or rather a consequence of HB 786, which happened in 2012, if I'm not mistaken, which had a Arizona type provision, an SB, a Section 2, a Clause 2 type provision, which gave local law enforcement authority to enforce immigration law. And so that was obviously very troublesome, very worrisome for the community, who thought that if they were driving down the street, they were going to get stopped based on racial profiling for immigration violations, and then be a part of the immigration process and deportation process just for driving without a license. And so you see how that progression has created wrong policies for the state. And what we've seen, for example, like I said before, Colorado had implemented a driver's license program about 2 years ago or so, and other states have had it in the past. So, right, the Colorado experience is a little bit too new to get some real data about it. The projections were that it was going to be very, very good. When 786 was actually created into a study here in North Carolina, the study did say that, first of all, the Arizona type provisions of the law would actually be very negative for the state, and that's why the legislator who introduced the new version of 786, which was 328, decided to take that part out. So unfortunately, we are not dealing with that anymore. However, we still had a bunch of anti-immigrant provisions within the law. And so what we're seeing is that in other states like New Mexico, for example, and Utah, who have had driver's license provisions and driving permit provisions for their undocumented communities for quite a while now, their rates of uninsured drivers went down about 20%. And so clearly that is an issue that has, first of all, increased the safety of other drivers and increased the safety of the community and created safer roads within that state. And so these are type of policies that actually make sense for the times that we are living in, like Patrick was saying. And as Patrick was talking, I was just reminded of a call that I had this morning, and I know my colleague Kayla Marditos in the back has dealt with this issue profusely as well, whereas you are driving the economy, you are creating, immigrant communities are creating small businesses, right? And you buy a house, let's say, for example, and you've had enough capital, you build enough income to get your first home, yet you can't hook up your utilities because you don't have an identification. Because the utilities department is not allowing you to hook up the water. And there was a lawsuit not too long ago in Dallas, North Carolina, where someone had bought a mobile home and actually had to get water from their neighbors. They were running a hose from their neighbor's house into their own, so they can actually do their daily daily lives, really. I mean, what can you do without water? And I just had this conversation with someone yesterday. So those are the policies that we are trying to tackle with this information, right? Because a lot of the language sort of drives the policies. And the other issue that I think has been very important for the immigrant community is this in-state tuition issue for both undocumented immigrants and now for DACA recipients. North Carolina does not does not grant in-state tuition for kids that have deferred action. As I mentioned before, when you have deferred action, you have a guarantee from the U.S. government that you are not going to be deported for a period of 2 years, and you can renew it, and you have a work permit, so you are able to work legally, right? However, if you have been, and by the way, in order to qualify for DACA, you have to have lived in the United States since 2007, at the very least, right? And so the problem that we're seeing is that these kids have been here for a very long time. And again, at least 2007, some of them have been here for much, much longer, yet they don't qualify for in-state tuition. And for someone who has been educated in a North Carolina high school, who has gone to North Carolina schools, who has gotten in North Carolina a GED in North Carolina, right? What's the return on investment? You're actually educating these kids in the high school level in public schools, and yet now when it comes to higher education, it's not accessible because it's cost prohibitive. Even at the local level, even at the community college level, that can be very expensive, specifically if you come from a family that is low income, that has been working in agriculture, has been working in service industries where you're not going to make a lot of money to send your kid to school. And so secondary education has become very, very difficult, or higher education has been very difficult for immigrant communities. And so you're seeing no return on investment on those kids. And so last year, I know there was a bill introduced to recognize in-state tuition for at least for DACA recipients who are now again able to work. But unfortunately, that bill really didn't go anywhere. It was just introduced and it did not even get a hearing. Then those are the negative policies that we are seeing that affect the immigrant community in North Carolina. We're not, so far the conversations have really clouded, the data have really clouded the sensible solutions to problems that we are seeing within our communities. So I'll let Patrick sort of give closing remarks to wrap up.
Well, I guess.
Sure.
I do think it is important to recognize that even with all of these negative policy changes of really disturbing rhetorical environment, that really those forces are fighting against the fundamental demographic changes within the United States, against the obvious economic importance that of immigrants in the United States and North Carolina, and against a growing recognition that it does nothing good for us to try to throw up walls against folks that are already here, that are already contributing to our economy. So, sure, we haven't gotten in-state tuition for immigrant children in North Carolina. But the fact that there was a bill that was even introduced by a Republican, and that there were a substantial chunk of the leadership that were sympathetic to it. Now, it didn't end up moving, but the fact that there was even an openness to the conversation this year, particularly in a year in which they ultimately were then going to pass a pretty damaging anti-immigrant piece of legislation, the fact that you could even have a conversation about a progressive, positive change says a lot about the fact that this is an issue that does not break cleanly along ideological lines. And there have been some other states, and not all of them bastions of progressive liberalism, that have taken up driver's license permits, that have taken up in-state tuition, that have looked at various ways to be more welcoming. So I guess I was just, as I was thinking about this, just wanted to reflect from my own sort of family's personal experience. Both the long-term optimism that I have for where this is heading, but also why it's important at this particular moment from a policy and a rhetorical point of view to be very actively contesting the negative stereotypes that we see coming out. Because, Patrick John McHugh, very, very, particularly on my father's side, we are very, very Irish and very proud of this fact. This is still a part of our cultural identity. And even though none of my grandparents were born outside the United States, and I think only one of my great-grandparents was born out of the United States. The point is, we've been here for several generations, and I was still raised with the shadow of no Irish need to apply as part of my cultural understanding. There was still a sense that America wasn't entirely happy to have us around. Now, that was ludicrous. I mean, it was absurd that I was being raised that way, but it was still the case. This was still a story that had lived in our family for generations, from when it was actually real to the point where I never saw a single bit of it, but I was still raised as if that was a thing in the culture. So my point is that exclusion and bigotry can cast a very long historical shadow. And so that's why we need to be pushing back against these forces right now, so that it doesn't take 2, 3, 4 generations for folks that are currently here to be fully here.
And just to I guess finalize, Patrick's probably more optimistic than I am. because I'm from because I'm from New Jersey. I grew up in Jersey. But yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a generational shift. I think for the most part, you know, if you look at and throughout history, you look at the immigrant waves. You know, Asian Americans, you know, in the early 1900s, late 1800s. You look at Irish Americans in the 1920s, it was a generational thing. It was a generational shift that they're given the opportunity to create businesses and to integrate themselves into, you know, immigrants integrating themselves into the fabric of the American society, of the United States. And I think it's going to take a little bit. Specifically, and one of the why I'm irked at the in-state tuition is because I think education plays a huge role in that integration process. And the most we can do in that arena, I think the best, it's the best that we can do so that we get positive policies going forward.
Join me all in thanking our amazing